November, 1878. The wind had a blade for an edge. It came down from the peaks with a hunger for warmth, scouring the high, empty plains of Wyoming. Eleanor felt it through the seams of her husband's old coat, a garment worn thin by a man who was no longer there to fill it. Her hands were the worst. The knuckles were split and bleeding, wrapped in strips of flour sack that did little but stain red. She was lifting the last stone. It was sandstone, flat and heavy, the color of dried blood and sunset. Her 70-year-old mother, Hester, steadied the rough timber lever, her breath a white plume in the freezing air. The cold did not care about their age, or their grief, or the purpose of their endless labor. The cold was simply cold. A horse approached, its hooves crunching on the frozen ground. Mr. Sterling, the man who owned the town and the land under their feet, reined in. He looked from the two women to the impossible structure they had built around their small wooden cabin. A wall, 8 feet high and 3 feet thick, enclosing a quarter-acre of worthless dirt. He did not get off his horse. He looked down at Eleanor, at her chapped face and the raw grief that had settled deep in her eyes. "You've built your own tomb, Mrs.," he said, his voice flat, without malice, a simple statement of fact. A fool's wall against a fool's winter. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving the words to hang in the air. Eleanor did not watch him go. She and her mother heaved, and the last stone settled into place. The wall was finished. But it was not a tomb. Inside, beneath a carefully angled canvas sheet, a single, impossible leaf of lettuce was pushing its way through the cold soil. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of how a wall of stone became a house of life. Eleanor had not been born to this high, lonesome country. She arrived 3 years earlier, the wife of a man from Ohio with a hopeful heart and lungs that were slowly betraying him. They had bought this small plot from Mr. Sterling with promises and a down payment of everything they owned. The thin, dry air, the doctor had said, would be a cure. It was not. Her husband, Daniel, lasted 1 winter, and was buried in the frozen ground come spring. He left her with his worn coat, a half-finished cabin, and a debt to Mr. Sterling that might as well have been a mountain. The town offered its condolences. They were practical people. They understood loss. But they did not understand Eleanor. After the initial period of neighborly sympathy, a quiet judgment settled in. A young widow, not yet 25, should have sold the useless plot back to Sterling for pennies, taken a position as a housekeeper in town, or gone back east to whatever family she had. Eleanor did none of these things. She stayed. And she began to read. Daniel had brought a small crate of books, not novels or poetry, but dry, practical volumes. A geological survey of the territory. An almanac from 1850. A thin pamphlet on French intensive gardening techniques. To the town, this was her first sign of madness. A woman in her position should be mending, cooking, praying for a new husband. She was instead seen pacing her small plot, holding a book in one hand and crumbling dirt in the other. She spent a week's food money to order a soil treatise from a catalogue. She learned obsessively. She noted the path of the winter sun, how it struck the southern face of the low cliff behind her cabin for 6 hours a day, even in December. She observed the wind, how it came almost exclusively from the northwest, a relentless, desiccating force. She asked questions at the general store that made people uncomfortable. She asked the blacksmith about the iron content of the local rock. She asked a passing surveyor about the water table. The questions were not rude. They were simply questions nobody had ever thought to ask. They were the questions of someone trying to understand the land, not just survive upon it. The rejection was not a single event. It was a slow, systemic turning away. It was the way conversation stopped when she entered the store. It was the offers of work that were always for less than a man would be paid. It was the quiet certainty that she was not suited for this place. The world they had built had rules, and she was breaking them not with defiance, but with quiet, persistent inquiry. Her mother, Hester, arrived that second summer. A letter had finally reached her in Ohio, and she came west on the train with a single carpet bag and the same quiet resilience as her daughter. She was 70, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes were clear. She did not question Eleanor's books. She watched, and she added her own knowledge, a wisdom not from pages but from a lifetime of making do. The community saw it as two stubborn women clinging to a mistake. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, stopped by one afternoon with a basket of bread and a dose of pity. She saw the books spread on the rough-hewn table, the strange diagrams Eleanor had drawn of sun angles and windbreaks. "A woman's place is in a home, dear," she'd said, her voice dripping with concern that felt like a judgment. "Not a library of dirt." That autumn, the inciting event arrived in the form of Mr. Sterling. He was not a cruel man, but a practical one. The debt from Daniel was long past due. He informed Eleanor that if the full amount was not paid by the first thaw, he would be forced to reclaim the land. He held the deed. The law was on his side. It was a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic regret. That evening, Eleanor and her mother sat in the cabin, the lamp oil burning low. They had no money. They had no prospects. They had a quarter-acre of rocky soil, a cliff at their back, and an idea from a book about Roman vineyards built on sun-facing slopes. They would not run. They would build. The work began at dawn the next day. Quarrying the sandstone was a brutal education in leverage and exhaustion. The low cliff behind the cabin was composed of layers, weathered and fractured by millennia of freeze and thaw. They had no dynamite, no heavy machinery. They had 2 iron pry bars, a sledgehammer with a cracked handle, and a mule borrowed from a prospector in exchange for mending his clothes for the winter. Eleanor would find a crack, a line of weakness in the rock face. She would drive a wedge in with the sledgehammer, the shock of the impact traveling up her arms, vibrating into her teeth. Then she and Hester would work the pry bars in, heaving with a coordinated rhythm born of silent understanding. Their combined weight, barely 300 pounds, was a paltry thing against the weight of the stone. But they learned the geometry of force. They learned to listen for the groan the rock made just before it gave way. Sometimes a piece would split clean, a slab 4 feet long and 6 inches thick. More often, it would shatter into useless rubble. Each usable piece was a victory measured in sweat and blood. The skin on Eleanor's palms tore, healed over, and tore again, callousing into something tough and alien. Hester's joints swelled in the cold, a deep, persistent ache she never spoke of. She would simply move slower, her movements more deliberate, her breathing more labored. They moved the stones on a crude sledge, the mule straining, its hooves slipping on the icy ground. Each journey of 50 yards from the cliff face to the growing wall was a small, perilous pilgrimage. The town watched. From a distance, they saw 2 small figures, ant-like in their ceaseless, seemingly pointless labor. The whispers in the general store were not unkind, not exactly. They were filled with a kind of weary pity. The poor widow had finally broken. Her old mother was enabling a fantasy. By October, the physical toll was becoming severe. Their food stores were dwindling. They were on half rations of cornmeal and dried beans. Eleanor felt a persistent, dull headache from hunger. When she stood up too quickly, the world would swim in a grey haze, and she would have to grip the cold stone of the wall to steady herself. Her fingers, raw from the rock, went from burning to numb. Some mornings, she could not feel them at all. They were just foreign objects at the ends of her arms. The shivering was constant. It was a deep, internal tremor that started in her bones and worked its way out. Her teeth ached from chattering. One night, a deep, bitter cold descended. The water in the bucket by the door froze solid. Lying in her thin bedroll, Eleanor listened to the wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin. It sounded like a predator, testing the walls for a way in. The half-finished stone wall outside seemed a monument to her own foolishness. It was a ruin before it was even completed. She thought about giving up. The thought was a warm, seductive thing. She could walk into town in the morning. She could go to Mr. Sterling, admit defeat. She could beg for a position cleaning his large, warm house. She remembered the smell of baking bread from his kitchen, the thick oatmeal she'd been served once when she went to plead for more time. She hated that oatmeal. She hated its bland, condescending nourishment. But now, the memory of its warmth was an almost unbearable temptation. She could be warm. She could be fed. She only had to surrender. She lay in the dark, and for the first time, she considered that this small, cold cabin might be where her story ended. Something pulled her back. It was not a vision. It was not a voice. It was the sound of her mother, Hester, quietly humming a tune from her childhood in Ohio. A simple, tuneless little song. It was the sound of persistence. And then, a sentence from one of her books surfaced in her mind. Stone holds the memory of the sun. It was not poetry. It was physics. The dense sandstone, she had read, absorbed solar radiation during the day and released it slowly through the night. It was a battery for heat. Her wall was not a tomb. It was a promise. The next morning, the body made a decision before the mind could argue. She got up. She broke the ice in the water bucket. She choked down a spoonful of cold cornmeal mush. The practical problem of survival demanded her attention. There was a stone to move. That was all. The discovery, when it came, was not a sudden revelation. It was a quiet confirmation. They had enclosed the space on 3 sides, leaving the south-facing cliff as the 4th wall. One afternoon, with the wall finally complete, the sun was sinking, painting the snow on the distant peaks in shades of apricot and rose. The air temperature was dropping fast. Eleanor walked into the enclosure. The wind was gone. The silence was immediate, profound. The air inside the walls was still. She walked to the inner face of the west wall, the last to receive the sun's rays. She placed her raw, bare palm against the stone. It was not warm. It was not what a person would call warm. But it was distinctly less cold than the air. It held a faint, residual energy, a ghost of the afternoon sun. She then walked to the cliff face at the back. The dark rock there was the same. A repository of stored light. She dropped to her knees in the dirt. There were no tears. There was no great cry of relief. There was only a deep, quiet feeling that she could not name, except for the word right. The theory was sound. The land, which people had called worthless, had given her a gift that people had refused to. It had given her a chance. Now the real work began. The wall was a vessel, they still had to fill it with life. The soil inside the enclosure was thin and rocky, the same poor stuff that covered the entire valley. For 2 weeks, they hauled better soil in buckets from a small, protected hollow a quarter-mile away. It was back-breaking, repetitive work. They amended this new soil with every scrap of organic matter they could find, composted kitchen scraps, dried leaves, and the precious manure from the mule, which they treated like gold. They built cold frames against the south-facing cliff, the warmest part of the enclosure. With no sheets of crystal to trap the heat, they improvised. Eleanor stretched spare canvas over wooden frames, then meticulously painted the fabric with rendered animal fat. The oil made the canvas translucent, allowing a diffuse, milky light to pass through while trapping the air beneath. It was not perfect, but it would have to be enough. Water was the next problem. The nearest creek was a half-mile away, and hauling buckets through the snow would be impossible. But Eleanor had noticed a small, persistent seep of moisture high up on the cliff face behind the cabin. It was a tiny spring, barely a trickle, emerging from a limestone seam. Hester, using the knowledge of her farmer father, showed Eleanor how to dig a narrow channel, a rill, no wider than a hand's breadth. They lined it with flat stones, creating a tiny, gravity-fed aqueduct that brought the water down the cliff face and into a small cistern they dug and lined with clay. The water was cold, but it was constant. Their tools were a catalogue of ingenuity. A broken wagon wheel, found half buried in a dry wash, was taken to the blacksmith. Eleanor did not have the coin to pay him for his work, but she traded a promise, the first pick of whatever she managed to grow. He grumbled, but his wife had a winter cough, and the thought of fresh greens was a powerful motivator. He heated and hammered the iron rim into 2 crude but effective hoe blades. Eleanor fashioned handles from sturdy aspen branches, lashing the blades on with strips of wet rawhide that tightened as they dried. A spade was made from a sharpened piece of shale, fitted into a split log. Every object was a testament to making do. The first proof came in late January. Outside the walls, the world was a study in white and grey. A blizzard had buried the landscape under 3 feet of snow. The temperature at night dropped to 20 below zero. Inside the walled garden, under the greasy light of the oiled canvas, something miraculous was happening. A row of lettuce, pale but determined, had unfurled its leaves. Radishes, small and fiercely red, were swelling in the dark soil. Eleanor lifted the canvas on the largest cold frame. The air that rose up was cool, but it smelled of damp earth and living things. It was the smell of spring in the dead of winter. She reached in and plucked a single lettuce leaf. It was cool and crisp against her fingers. She put it in her mouth. The taste was faint, but it was undeniably the taste of life. It was proof. She brought the leaf into the cabin. She tore it in two and handed half to her mother. They ate it slowly, in silence. It was not just food. It was the culmination of months of pain, of doubt, of back-breaking labor. It was a quiet triumph that no one else in the world knew about. An ally arrived in February. Not a savior, but a witness. Her name was Agnes. She was an old Shoshone woman who lived alone in a small shack at the far edge of the valley, a place the townsfolk avoided. They said she was touched by the spirits, that she spoke to the crows. She appeared at their wall one afternoon, a silent figure in a heavy blanket coat. She did not knock. She simply stood and watched. Eleanor, wary at first, went out to meet her. Agnes pointed a gnarled finger toward the cold frames. "You listen to the land," she said. It was not a question. Agnes recognized immediately what Eleanor and Hester were doing. She saw the logic in the wall, the wisdom in the water channel. She had seen similar things done by her own people, long ago. She did not see witchcraft, she saw knowledge. She began to visit every few days. She brought seeds for plants Eleanor had never heard of, or a hardy, bitter green that thrived in the cold, a root that tasted like a nutty potato. She showed Hester which wild herbs, growing even now in the shelter of the rocks, could be made into a tea to soothe her mother's persistent cough. Agnes never offered pity or charity. She offered knowledge, an exchange between equals. She had a skill the books could not provide. She recognized in Eleanor something the community refused to see, a mind that worked in concert with the land, not against it. The town's skepticism was a harder wall to breach than the one made of stone. The first time Eleanor walked into the general store with a small basket of radishes, the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, laughed. "What's this then?" he asked, picking one up. "A winter miracle." "A trade," Eleanor said simply. "For flour." He scoffed. "Witch's work," he muttered, but his curiosity got the better of him. He bit into a radish. His eyes widened. The sharp, peppery snap was an explosion of flavor in a world that had tasted only of salt pork and dried beans for months. He made the trade. The preacher, from his pulpit, warned of unnatural harvests, of prideful attempts to alter God's given seasons. He did not name Eleanor, but everyone knew who he meant. The whispers continued. But then, a second, more brutal blizzard swept through in late February. It lasted 8 days. The supply wagon from Cheyenne was overdue, presumed lost in a drift. The town's carefully hoarded supplies began to run out. The conversion began not with admiration, but with need. The blacksmith's wife, her cough worsening, was the first. Her husband came to the wall, his hat in his hands, and asked to trade his labor for some of the bitter greens Agnes had told them about. Eleanor gave them freely. He had, after all, forged their tools. A few days later, a young family with a sick child came. The boy was listless, his skin pale. The mother was frantic. They had nothing but flour and bacon fat to feed him. "Please," she whispered, her face streaked with tears. "Anything green." Eleanor filled a sack with lettuce and kale. She asked for nothing in return. The next week, the boy was seen playing in the snow outside his cabin. Word spread through the town, not on the wind of gossip, but through the quiet, undeniable testimony of a child's recovery. People started coming. They came one by one, or in small family groups. They came with shame in their eyes, their earlier judgments hanging unspoken between them. They came for the food. They brought what they could to trade, a few cartridges for a hunter, a ball of yarn, a mended pot. Eleanor and Hester took what was offered, but gave whether there was a trade or not. They were not running a business. They were feeding people. The community did not hold a ceremony to admit its error. It converted quietly, through hunger. The wall, once a symbol of foolishness, had become the town's unlikely heart. March arrived, and with it, the thaw. The world began to soften at the edges. One afternoon, a horseman appeared again. It was Mr. Sterling. He dismounted before he reached the wall, an act of deference that did not go unnoticed. He looked different. The hard certainty he carried like a second coat was gone. He was smaller than Eleanor remembered, his face etched with the worry of a man who had lost a significant portion of his cattle to the storms. The hardness in him had gone soft in the wrong direction. He walked to where Eleanor was turning over soil in a newly cleared bed. He did not look at the verdant life inside the wall. He looked at the ground. He needed something. Not for himself, he explained, but for the town. The supply wagon had finally arrived, but it brought news of a blight that had ruined much of the seed grain back east. What they had in town was not enough to plant the common fields. They were facing a hungry spring and a hungrier summer. He was not asking for food. He was asking for knowledge. He wanted to know about their seeds, their methods. He was asking for help. Eleanor looked at this man who had dismissed her, who had called her life's work a tomb. She felt no anger, no triumph. He was just a man, responsible for a town full of people, and he was out of answers. She wiped her hands on her apron. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "How much seed will you need for the common plot?" she asked. From the cabin, Hester emerged, her arms full of small, cloth-wrapped bundles. They were starter plants, seedlings she had been nurturing in the warmest corner of the enclosure. She had anticipated the need. Her action was the only answer required. Sterling returned a week later. He did not offer an apology. A full apology would have been a lie, a performance for her benefit. Instead, he walked up to her and handed her a folded piece of paper. It was the deed to her land. Across the bottom, in his precise, neat script, were 2 words, "Paid in full." He cleared his throat. "The town thanks you," he said. It was as close to an admission of his own error as he was capable of getting. It had cost him the value of the land, a price he was willing to pay. He turned and left without another word. The transaction was complete. Hester came and stood beside her daughter, watching the man ride away. She saw the complex emotion on Eleanor's face. "A debt is a debt," the old woman said, her voice gentle but firm. Now the books are balanced. It was a practical observation, not a declaration of forgiveness. The work was what mattered. Years passed. The walled garden did not just survive, it flourished. It became the town's agricultural laboratory. Eleanor, no longer the strange widow, became its quiet teacher. She taught the children how to save seeds, how to read the sun and the soil. She taught anyone who came to her gate with an honest question. The techniques they had pioneered, born of desperation and a few dry books, were adapted and used throughout the county, changing the way people farmed in that high, harsh country. Hester lived another decade, her final years spent in the warmth of the garden she had helped build. She died peacefully in her sleep. Eleanor lived to be a very old woman. She never remarried. The garden was her life's work, her partner, her legacy. She died one autumn afternoon, decades after that first terrible winter, sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of her cabin. She was looking out at the sandstone wall, now weathered and softened by time, covered in a filigree of green moss. In her lap was a small, open packet of tomato seeds saved for the next season. From inside the wall, she could hear the rhythmic sound of a spade turning the earth. It was the sound of a young woman she had trained, a girl who had come to her years ago, full of questions nobody else would answer. The work was continuing. They buried her next to her mother and her husband. Her headstone, carved by the grandson of the blacksmith whose tools she had designed, bore a single, short sentence. It read, "She made the stone live." The garden fed the town for 3 generations, until the railroad made it easier to ship food from elsewhere. But the wall still stands. A monument to a woman the world tried to put in a box, who decided to build her own, and fill it with life. You have a wall you have been told is foolish. A barrier you are building around a fragile, unproven idea. You have a gift the world has no category for, a quiet knowledge that others dismiss as madness. What memory of the sun are you meant to hold? What garden are you standing just outside of, waiting for permission that will never come? The stone is cold. The work is hard. But inside, something is waiting to grow. The wall was not a tomb. It was a seed. True survival is not about enduring the winter. It is about creating your own season. We tell stories of quiet magnificence. If that is a language you understand, subscribe, and join us for the story of the lighthouse keeper who charted the stars with a stolen telescope.